In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Sometimes we do a thing, we do make a small mistake, but it keeps growing and we lose control over ourselves. We keep moving forward. Later on, we do have to regret and repent. Later on, we do have to bear the big loss, big trouble. Look upon the disputes. Many of the big fights began from something very small. Many of the big disputes start from something very small, which could have been easily ignored, which could have been and should have been ignored, which was not a big thing at all, something trivial, something which should not have been taken even notice of. But we started arguing, we started squabbling, and it kept growing, growing, and growing. Each of the participant tried to hurt others, even in a bigger manner. We became angry. Anger actually puts us somewhere where we don't have a control over ourselves. We lose control over ourselves. We are so angry. Anger is something quite destructive. Anger is something which is quite destructive. We should have used the senses. We should have become patient. We should have showed tolerance. But we didn't exercise the right things, like tolerance, like patience, like using the senses instead of using the anger. And the highly beneficial thing, the highly beneficial attitude of staying quiet, bearing, and even tendering excuse where we are not much wrong, simply to avoid the dispute, simply to avoid creating the issue. There are so much of the necessary and the good things to do, waiting for our time, energy, and the rest of the resources to be utilized upon. Instead of wasting our time, energy, financial and other resources over fighting with other people for something which is actually nothing. Control the fights from the very, very, very beginning. The earlier we try to control it, the easier it is, the more effective it is. But as it keeps growing, so it becomes difficult and more difficult and even more difficult to control, to manage. Many of the big fights, many of the big fights started for something very small, started for something very small which could have been easily ignored and overlooked. But since there was no tolerance, there was no patience, there was no self control exhibited by either side, that became the reason of escalation we must have avoided the escalation. We must have avoided the escalation. Now look upon the youth, the younger folks who are found indulging in the drugs. From where this thing started? It started from smoking. They smoke a cigarette because a friend of theirs, a class fellow of theirs, was found smoking, and she offered them a free cigarette. They became smoker, and from being a smoker they tried other they tried the drugs as well, the mild drugs in the beginning, to become happy, to become happy, to ward off the unhappiness and low feelings. They became addict, and they kept their addiction kept growing, and a time arrived when they became almost untreatable, where a time arrived where they completely destroyed themselves. And now look upon another thing which is called porn, the word of porn. The people start watching the things, some sort of a bit of nudity and so much so-called glamour, but they kept moving forward on their smartphone, and then they became the addict of they developed the addiction of porn, which is psychologically damages us a lot, and physically and psychologically there are quite a lot of dangerous consequences. I am unable to put the details, and even the time does not allow it. Plus the plus it is not so, it is not so easy to discuss and to debate upon. Start controlling the things from the very beginning. It is far more easier. It is quite easy. It is not difficult at all. But once the things get moving forward, and it becomes more and more and more difficult. Control the things from the very beginning if you do want to avoid, if at all we do want to avoid making the big mistakes. The small mistakes leads us to the big mistakes, and to even the bigger mistakes. And if we do want to avoid, if at all we do want to avoid the big mistakes, all what we need to do is that we need to avoid the small mistakes. And if at all we want to avoid the small mistakes, we do have to avoid the smaller mistakes, and we need to control it from the very beginning. We need to exercise our disciplinary muscles from the very beginning. The things will remain under control, inshallah, and we don't have to repent and regret later on. Thank you.